Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the movie Money Talks, which is currently under the second recording on Netflix. So, ultimately, what this story lacks in actually a creative story, we ultimately have it to where, reasonably, when looking at it, it's really made up for the fact that we have actors that can just deliver great performances. We end up having it to a reasonably Chris Tucker and Charlie Sheen are really just working at these stories and really. It seems that maybe I'm assessing that maybe some of these lines could have maybe been improvised or maybe they were trying some things. Like I honestly don't really and truly I think maybe believe that there was even really seemingly a script for this movie, to be brutally honest. It just seems like a lot of people were just trying things on and attempting things. It doesn't feel like there is actually legitimately a script for this movie, but I could be wrong. Um, when going into this, I thought that this movie is hilarious. I think that this movie is still hilarious for however long it's been out. It's a hilarious film when looking at it. It's yet another Chris Tucker movie where at some point you'd be laughing at somebody that somebody said at some point, which is normally Chris Tucker. So going into this, we have it to where a lot of times Charlie Sheen's character is kind of setting up uh, what is to eventually be Chris Tucker's jokes. Like basically having it to where Charlie Sheen is ultimately telling Chris Tucker what not to do, and of course Chris Tucker is going to be obviously the person that is going to do the thing that ultimately Charlie Sheen's character says not to do. So going into this movie, it's kind of one of those very like 48 hours kind of stories where ultimately we have it to where seemingly there is a time of which where we have it to where Franklin is ending up getting probably wrongly arrested, and we end up having it to where Franklin is otherwise chained or tied to a seemingly another villain-esque like person who I believe is Raymond. Because ultimately, heaven forbid, there was actually a photo of him actually showcasing his face. So we end up seemingly have it to where the people that are working with Raymond are going to otherwise try and break him out of this uh, prison bus. And so we end up reasonably having it to where now there's a real chase. There's ultimately information about uh, seemingly some expensive items to where we lay a chase upon this movie. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Charlie Sheen ultimately things aren't going well with him and his um way of business, and so ultimately he is going to eventually try and in desperation to find some way to be able to re-succeed in his business. And a lot of times I would probably say that this is kind of like the April O'Neil approach of doing a story and or portion of approaching in a movie and so on and so forth. So because we have it where ultimately Charlie Sheen, yes, is a reporter and ultimately is desperate to try to find that one story that is going to make his career. Ultimately, we have it where kind of reminds me of the movie Nightcrawler in some ways, where instead of having it where Charlie Sheen is like shooting like a video of himself, a video of whatever's going on, and being the cameraman for this news thing, we end up instead having it to where, of course, like Charlie Sheen is the news anchor for any normal news, whatever, what have you. I honestly think that reasonably, I kind of wish that there were actual more movies out there like Nightcrawler because I thought that movie was actually really fascinating and I really enjoyed it. Um, for how like vicious it ends up becoming, how eventually it seems like you don't really know much about the main character, but the more that you go on, you realize how really shady and or underhanded this character really is. And I thought that was so interesting to eventually see the point in time where this guy would slowly but surely, via underhanded measures, just basically just be able to, um, like basically just blow any competition like out of the water, basically, because we had it to where ultimately, and that kind of feels like a movie that I just recently saw called The Founder. So give me a sip here. Whoo! A lot of reviewing today. A lot of reviewing. Um, this will be my third, and I gotta do one more after this, and then call it a day. I hope after that. Um, so yeah, so we end up having it to where ultimately Franklin is mixed up in Charlie's world, or in James Russell's world, and vice versa. So we end up having it to where reasonably we find out that Charlie's kind of at the high end of life. It seems that he's marrying into money. We end up finding out that Franklin is ultimately in desperation to find money, and ultimately that is where the journey is, or where the real story takes place within this movie. So, again, this movie is hilarious. There's so many scenes that ultimately, if you've never seen this movie before, you'll watch it and you'll probably bust out laughing because really, there's a lot of hilarious things going on in this movie. I thought it was funny. Um, I don't know. Maybe the jokes don't like the jokes may not stand the test of time. Maybe what I think is hilarious may not be good enough for now more modern day people. I don't know, but I thought the movie was funny. I still think it is, and so when looking at it, that's all I have to say. So let's go out of our way to ultimately go into that double five to talk about spoilers about this movie. Check it out. Really, without a doubt. It really doesn't have the best story, but reasonably anything otherwise other than that. Like remembering the God, there was I think one Adam Sandler, one of the Wayans brothers. Um, ultimately, I think Adam Sandler did a movie called Bulletproof, which ultimately had James Caan in it, and I could be wrong about that. You ultimately have it to where that movie was really interesting, and it's not quite the exact same kind of approach of story, but I thought that movie was interesting as well. So, but I'm not quite 100% sure on the title. But go check that out. It probably has the word bullet in it. It's like bulletproof. Anyways, moving on. So, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. If I haven't said already, it's about that time. So, we end up, like I said, we end up having it to where Franklin ends up going and escaping from prison. Ultimately, he owns a car wash, and ultimately, he had gone to prison from ultimately talking to some gangster of sorts. So, we end up having it to where seemingly that Franklin is to go to prison and otherwise be forced to um, escape with some Raymond Esch-like character. So we end up having it to where seemingly Franklin is to go on this wild ride with his Raymond character, and we ultimately end up finding out that seemingly there are diamonds hidden within some Jaguar that is going to be auctioned off somewhere. So we end up having it to where Franklin had deciphered or heard some of the words that ultimately these guys had said, and they're like, and he's like, "Where? What about diamonds? What about Jaguar? What are you talking about?" So we end up having it to where ultimately, so Franklin ends up getting thrusted off of this helicopter to land into the ocean, and so we end up finding out that Charlie Sheen, after getting the worst interview with Franklin Hatchet, we end up having it to where Charlie Sheen ends up going to his news anchor job to be fired, to be let go. Ultimately, we have it to where James Russell's boss is ultimately thinking that he's just another good looking kid, and that's about it. So we end up finding out that it seems that James Russell's character ends up getting back into the clutches of Franklin, and so we ultimately have it to where James uses a one-on-one interview with Franklin uh, to kind of hold hostage of the fact of getting his job back with his boss. So we end up having it to where James is ultimately waiting for the weekend to bog down to ultimately cover this news thing during sweeps week. So we end up having it to where James is taking Franklin along with him to do everything. It seems that also we have uh, some wedding dinner to have Franklin forcibly go into to meet all of James's family. We end up finding out that supposedly James is kind of telling exactly what Franklin is to not do. So we end up having it to where Franklin ends up watching like an infomercial talking about the greatest hits of Frank Damone or whatever, and so ultimately we have it to where like Franklin is ultimately like, who is Frank Damone? I've never heard of Frank Damone. Like, why is it that why is that this guy is greatest hits? I've never heard of this guy before. Like, I think this is actually the funniest thing because when looking at it, there's so many bizarre-ish infomercials that never really made sense to me. How all of a sudden, like, this guy comes out of nowhere and all of a sudden has all these great music and whatever and all this and that, and you've never heard of him in your life. It's so odd. So we end up having it toward James's character is ultimately telling Franklin, "Hey, like, go in here and be very polite, be very nice, and whatever." And ultimately, like, don't tell my future wife, that she's fat. Like, don't mention anything about her weight. So right away, we have it to ultimately. Franklin is making up to James's father-in-law that ultimately he's Frank Damone Jr. He's Frank Damone's son, and we end up having it to where ultimately Guy Bisiani, I guess, ultimately Grace's father ultimately is to just be like, oh yeah, like you're half this and half Italian. Oh, okay, all right. Like I can see that you can be Frank Damone Jr.'s son. So we end up having it to where Guy ends up taking a liking to Franklin right away, and so we end up finding out that ultimately, Grace, who is Charlie's wife, ends up coming in there, and we end up having it uh, to where Franklin says, "Dang girl, you fat," and she's like, "Oh," and he's like, "Yeah, you fat girl, PHAT, pretty hot and tempting." Mm-hmm. So we end up having Grace going, "Oh, well, that's nice of you to say, maybe." So we end up having it to where James is just like, "Oh my god, I am gonna just kill you," because like he is just foaming at the mouth, just blah 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 blah. So we end up having it to where Franklin is just spouting all kinds of nonsense, and like God, like Chris Tucker is so hilarious in this movie. Like there are some kind of lines and stuff that I feel kind of are mimicked in the movie The Fifth Element, but we'll kind of give him a little leeway on that. Ultimately, when we have it to where he's in the helicopter and he's like, "What you screaming for?" Like, ultimately just reminds me of The Fifth Element. So we end up having it to where Chris Tucker ends up going and just really like buying the affection of pretty much everyone in this family with the exclusion of the mother of Grace. Where ultimately we have it to where Franklin ends up going and having a toast for both James and Grace, and he ends up quoting the lines of a Barry White song that he had just heard on the radio before coming here. And ultimately, he like says the whole verse line for line, and we end up having the mother going, "Isn't that Barry White?" And we ultimately have it to where after hearing the speech, Guy is ultimately just like, "Wow, that just was beautiful, man." And we have it to where Franklin's ultimately just like, "Yeah, I can do whatever, I just can do whatever I can do." So we end up having it to where James ends up pulling Franklin aside because like he's just writhing with agony, because we end up having it to where Franklin had told stories about uh, like seemingly James like sleeping with anybody in his bed, like sleeping with men, guys, goats, who knows. So we end up having it to where James is ultimately saying like, "Yeah, I slept with everybody under the sun. Uh-huh, sure, thanks, appreciate it." So we end up having it to where eventually James and Franklin end up getting into a tussle because reasonably uh, we have it to where Franklin ends up getting a call from his woman, and ultimately we have it to where Franklin is bailing on James because ultimately his woman is pregnant and he needs him, or she needs him, I mean. So we end up having it to where ultimately James and Franklin get into a tussle at some point in this movie. And the funniest thing is we have it to where ultimately like Franklin is bizarrely doing this like consistent like head jerk thing, like looking to see if anybody's like looking at him, and he pa pass pass. Like I think that is the most hilarious scene going on in this movie, where we ultimately have to where Franklin is like pretending that there is someone going to swoop in and stop Franklin from hitting uh, James, and I think it's just hilarious how it seemed um, like quite possible that like James has this like weird bizarre head jerk that ultimately someone's gonna like pop in on him trying to uh, punch out James at some point. So we end up having Franklin before he leaves, ultimately giving, uh, at some point, getting breakfast with the family. Ultimately having it to where Franklin is telling Guy that eventually they need to go and get a Jaguar because ultimately a car is desperately what this family, what Grace and James need for a wedding present. So we end up having it to where so we have it to where ultimately James and Franklin go and see Franklin's wife, and it seems that the police end up bum rushing through the door because we end up having James mention to Franklin that's like, "Hey, like there's right there the police that are ultimately in that van right there. Um, that's your night watch. That's your detectives." So we end up having it to where Franklin ends up seeing his wife just to end up getting pulled away from her. Ultimately, bizarrely, James is muttering something about like some kind of uh, pregnant procedure, like some like sonogram or something like that. That ultimately, I'm sure he probably just sifted off of somewhere just to have some lines to say here. So we end up having it to where ultimately Franklin and his wife's reunion is interrupted by police, and so ultimately we have Franklin and James running off. So we end up having it to where the next day, so we end up going to this car auction, and we end up having it to where Guy is ultimately saying like, "Oh my God, these cars are amazing! Like Cary Grant uh, drove this car," and so on and so forth. Franklin is waiting for Raymond to just put his finger up to ultimately start bidding on a car. Because ultimately we have it to where Franklin knows it's a Jaguar, but he wants to confirm it by seeing Raymond bid for it. So we end up having this like consistent going on and on and on, where we have this bidding war between Raymond and Guy, and we have it to where Franklin is also like getting in on it as well, like kind of giving him like the middle finger and kind of like going like, yeah, like come on, like we end up having it to where like we really have like the auctioneer ultimately like kind of doing some hilarious things of ultimately saying like, yeah, we have the bidder over here that is welcoming all comers, and we have it to where this other bidder is ultimately like shooting a target at this wonderful piece of art, and so on and so forth, and like we have it to where so Guy ultimately wins the car, and we have it to where the only real true valuable thing is to get what is to be these diamonds from this car. Ultimately, the car does not matter because we end up having it to where Franklin ends up spending so much money for this Jaguar just for it to eventually be filled with bullet holes and to basically be destroyed, sadly enough. So we end up having it to where reasonably that Franklin is upon a chase to eventually hide these diamonds away from Raymond and anyone else that would probably owe Raymond money. But we eventually have it to where ultimately Franklin and James need to now ultimately seemingly uh, get to where ultimately they need to find the protection, aka guns, that they need, and ultimately they go and meet a guy named Aaron that seemingly has some guns that ultimately uh, Franklin can use if only that he gives him a really good seats for free, basically. So we end up having it to a reasonably. So Franklin ends up going off into refinding these diamonds yet again at the stadium. So we end up having it to where ultimately everyone is eventually uh, scrambling for Franklin, but also scrambling for these diamonds. So we eventually seemingly also have it to where, oops, uh, we end up having it to where it seems that we have Carmine that is kind of really going after Franklin ultimately. It seems that Carmine ultimately is owed money or whatever from Franklin, so we end up having it to where Franklin ends up telling Carmine to come to the stadium as well to basically uh, fend off of this Raymond mafia people from getting these diamonds. So, and eventually we also have to have Grace who breaks the truth to her family that that is not actually Victimone Jr.'s son, and so on and so forth. And we eventually have that funny notion of that. So we go on here, and so we have it to where everybody's kind of scrambling in the stadium. There's pandemonium going on. And so we ultimately have it to where Franklin ends up finding the diamonds, but then realizing that the diamonds are worth dying for. And so ultimately we have it to where he is kind of just bargaining to try to um, ultimately kind of get away with these diamonds. But eventually, the longer that we go upon here, eventually we start to see everybody start to just die off at some point. And because ultimately it seems like there's reasonably just like to where we are led to assume that uh, the diamonds are in seemingly one location, which they actually are not. We ultimately have it to where Franklin had ultimately kind of snuck away with the diamonds without anybody really knowing. So we end up having it to where reasonably everybody's after these diamonds, and so eventually we end up leading to everyone's death pretty much. To where ultimately we have it to where Franklin and and James are really in the clear. We ultimately end up having it to where uh, Franklin is to go to James' wedding, and ultimately have it be that seemingly they had a diamond saved for James's wedding, as well as any number of other diamonds. We end up finding out that a lot of times during this whole stadium thing, we end up having it to where Franklin keeps going on about like kind of what kind of portion of cut people are going to get, which I thought was interesting. We end up having it to where Franklin ends up mentioning like, well, yeah, like I'm going to keep like $5 million and I'll give you 10, and we end up having it to where they're like, dude, you're going to get a cut, and he's like, dude, I'm not doing all this for free. Like, sure, I'm going to get my cut. So yeah, so I thought that this is kind of like an interesting movie. I think there was an like an interesting approach to this towards the end there, but it was just a lot of work to get there. Eventually, we end up finding out that seemingly that the even the detectives, honestly, there was actually a dirty cop within these two cops. We end up having Lieutenant Bobby Pickett, who seems to be like the good cop out of the two cops that ultimately were like we have Detective Williams and Lieutenant Bobby Pickett, which we are to have assessed that ultimately Bobby is going to be the good cop the entire time, but eventually we eventually see that turn to where ultimately we have it to where the lieutenant ultimately goes and shoots the other detective, and ultimately he's ending up otherwise tied to Raymond, and so we just kind of end up seeing a lot of dissension and a lot of people ending up dying in the process. We end up having it to where Aaron ultimately goes into the stadium with a bazooka and all kinds of things. We ultimately at some point end up seeing a grenades end up being used in here and all kinds of things. So really just an interesting kind of climax, but everything before that was just kind of like very formulaic and just kind of very predictable, I think, for this movie. So I think reasonably that's all that I had really had to say about this movie. And I kind of rushed through a lot of it, so I do apologize. But justifiably, when also looking at this movie, I thought that there was a lot of fun parts when looking at it. Um, there was one point in the movie where ultimately we had it to where ultimately there was so many like points in which were ultimately uh, James was ultimately talking about that ultimately he doesn't have hot water in his shower. And we end up having Franklin throwing a fit about that. We ultimately had some point ending up having Franklin end up threatening James that ultimately at any moment that Franklin is going to sneak up behind him, even in the shower, even in the like, you need to be watching out for me, even in the shower and in the toilet. I'm coming after you. Like, it's freaking hilarious. We end up having it to her eventually that within this movie that there are so many interesting approaches to this movie, and that are all coming out of Chris Tucker. We end up having it to where reasonably we have a ton of lines that are just nailing and working, and I just thought were interesting. So eventually, towards the tail end of this movie, we end up having it to where Franklin is clear of all charges, and eventually it seems that he ends up doing the report after all, and it seems that he is going and like thanking his family and all kinds of other things. And so eventually we have it to where Franklin is back at working at the car wash, and it seems like everything is perfectly fine, as well as also having these diamonds that are, of course, going to make him a ton of money. So I think at the end of the day, that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. I think there's probably other several jokes that I could have gone into and talked about in here. But really, when looking at it, I think that's all that I really wanted to get out about this movie. I thought it was fun. I really enjoyed it, and so hopefully people will go back and enjoy it as well. Or ultimately, maybe they'll hate it. I don't know. Maybe they'll think that it's kind of just like there's too many cliches, or there's too many stereotypes. There's maybe too many other things. I don't know. Maybe this movie has too many stereotypes now for people. I don't know. But when looking at it, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this review. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.